And carrier-grade networks are critical for virtualized services and platforms as we transition from hardware to software-defined networking. But it's not only about 5 nines and carrier-grade networks, but also about performance, scalability, security, and manageability for carrier-grade services. I want to welcome two guests here to talk about this transition and the discussion from carrier-grade networking, or carrier-grade networks to carrier-grade services. I'll start with Dave Neary, SDN NFV Community Strategist with Red Hat. Peter Jarek with Current Analysis, the Vice President of Consumer and Infrastructure. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
So I want to start with you, Dave, about that transition and discussion from carrier-grade networks to carrier-grade services. How do you make NFV applications reliable in spite of an imperfect network?
Well, I think you mentioned the 4 pillars of carrier grade. So the carrier grade services have to be highly available. When you transition from physical to virtual infrastructure, you're building on top of a hardware layer and a platform layer, and your services sit on top. So the way you get that high availability is to have automation and resilient services. You make your services resilient to failures underneath in the platform.
I think what's interesting though, and we've seen this in some of our work with some of our customers, right? We have some vendors who really think carrier grade is a part of their value prop, right, to NFV. The problem is defining that isn't always easy. Like, it's a term, but what that actually means to every different operator has been a really difficult difficult conversation for them to have, just because it's going to differ from operator to operator, but also sort of getting behind, well, what does that mean, particularly in a virtualized environment?
And one of the things that's interesting to me is seeing the traditional concept of 5 nines, which you mentioned, losing importance in some sense in the NFV world, because your hardware may be 4 nines, your platform may be 5 nines, but you can, in spite of a reliable platform, still have unreliable services if they're not architected to take advantage of that platform. So the move to really moving to cloud native applications running on a virtualization platform is a key transition.
And unfortunately, it's the opposite that people want. You know, you talked about you could have unreliable services with reliable platforms or infrastructure. What you really want to get to is the opposite, right? Reliable services with an unreliable foundation beneath it, which is kind of the goal, right? I don't want to say unreliable. Clearly, that's no one wants to say that, but less than 5 nines infrastructure.
Resilient services.
Yes.
So high availability could be a different definition than carrier grade. Carrier grade could encompass a number of tenets, right? A number of principles. High availability is just 5 nines, is that?
So you want your service to be available, and your service is going to have to be available to a specific service level agreement for your operator. The point I'm making is that the service availability is independent of the reliability of the hardware and the underlying platform.
So in talking about network availability and performance, let's talk about fault detection. On virtual machine infrastructures, how far have we come on fault detection to this point?
That's an excellent example of a place where you enable resilient applications by giving the management applications managing those, the management layer managing those applications better awareness of what's happening in your infrastructure. So some of the projects we're working on here in OPNFV are related to fault management, root cause analysis, and policy to allow applications to adapt to changing circumstances in the platform. And that's key to the manageability aspect of the carrier grade definition.
Peter, we talked earlier about scalability in the cloud, but how do you apply that to telcos? And how are they receiving that?
Yeah, I think the concept of scalability in the cloud is, depending on the telco that you talk to, it's a bunch of different conversations, right? Because some of those folks, when we think about scalability in the cloud, these initial NFV discussions, right? Initial NFV discussions, a lot of them were about building this giant data center, right? And some of them were obviously building data centers for their own use cases, for public cloud services that they would be offering, or private cloud services they'd be offering. So some of them get it, right? Others clearly coming from a very different perspective, and that conversation has changed, particularly as we've gone from really NFV as this monolithic, I'm going to have a big data center where everything sits, to the realization that that just doesn't make sense, right? That you're not going to be delivering every single VNF from one big data center in the center of your country, right? You're gonna be delivering it from a whole bunch of different ones, and ideally from the edge of the network and everywhere in between. And so I think it depends, it's sort of a cop-out, but that conversation really depends upon the operator and how far along they are. The nice thing is there are some that clearly have seen the value and they understand sort of the direction they want to go, and they provide a little bit of an understanding for the other guys below. And for those other guys below, there's other vendor-based solutions that are out there to help them get there.
Is there an example, Dave, where you can give us whereby scalability is really integral for a telco in the NFV space?
Well, there are certainly, as you said, the ability to distribute an application across multiple sites and ensure that the application is resilient. Things like being able to provide application level resiliency to losing a data center. That's something that would be specific to the telecommunications industry. And that's something that we need to work towards.
And if you think about scalability, I mean, you really can't talk about, I think scalability within the NFV space and telcos, you probably have to talk about IoT, right? I mean, it seems like you can't have any conversation nowadays without IoT somehow creeping in because it's the buzzword, right? But that's the one that I hear a lot of in terms of as operators are thinking about where NFV intersects with some of what they're looking at and the need for scalability, right? Because you see these numbers of 50 trillion or billion or however many connected devices people think we're going to have online in the next 5 years, and scalability is one of their big concerns, right?
Right, so IPv6 everywhere is important. Being able to scale, as you say, with millions and billions of endpoints is an interesting challenge there. But there's also the scalability of the applications.
Completely.
Right? Moving from monolithic applications to automated, distributed, load-balanced applications which can run across multiple data centers, multiple sites. It's also another interesting challenge there.
So we're here at the Open Platform for NFV event in San Francisco for a couple of days, and a lot of the topics and conversations here at this venue are around open network architectures and software-defined applications running on top of those architectures. Aren't we opening ourselves up to huge vulnerabilities as far as security goes? And Dave, I'll let you start with that.
Well, certainly security is important. There are a number of areas where security is integral to the way that the telecommunications industry works, but I think security is important in general in the cloud. This is an environment where you've got multi-tenancy, you've got multiple applications that need to be able to be running on the same data center and have the data flow from those applications be isolated from each other. You have service providers that are providing services to multiple customers. You have additional security requirements that are pulled in due to regulations in the telecommunications industry. So security is a very, very high priority.
I mean, no doubt it's a high priority. I mean, I think we see the understanding that security is more important. Multi-layer security, right? How do we handle it? Really the recognition that it's going to be important to all these business models. I don't know that it's fully appreciated how important it is, to the extent that I think that it's oftentimes assumed that we'll get it figured out. And I think operators may have other things they want to get figured out first. Let's walk before we run. Let's get these things rolled out before we figure out the security side of things. So it seems like it's oftentimes sort of relegated, but it's good to see that it's percolating up and it's continuing. No one denies that it's important. The question is, do they recognize how important it is?
So Peter, if you can give our audience an example of what it means to have multi-tenant isolation and security for the operator in the NFV space.
Yeah, and so I think the question is, when we think about multi-tenancy, and we do surveys all the time of operators and whatnot of how they're thinking about it. Multi-tenancy comes up a lot. And I think what we've seen is the question is, multi-tenancy means different things depending upon, are you thinking about multiple applications within the same data center? Are we thinking about multiple customers, right? One of the value props of NFV, and we've seen this even before NFV was a term, right? The idea that I can go out as an operator and I can sell you, Mr. Enterprise, a specific instance of, let's say, an EPC, right? A virtual EPC. And then customer B gets their own instance of virtual EPC. So from a multi-tenancy standpoint, we're really talking about multiple things, right? We're talking about the concept of multiple applications, multiple customers, and obviously you need to have those isolated for all the obvious reasons. And we're talking about multiple applications. Those applications are going to have different demands, different requirements upon them. Those applications may be living on the same server, but they are still very different applications. Same thing with the customers, right? There'll be different SLAs for them, different requirements. Security obviously has to be tight between those customers because you can't have one problem bleed into another. But ultimately, multi-tenancy is critical to making some of these business models just work, because it's about getting back to that efficiency of how do we leverage that infrastructure as much as possible.
Dave, you mentioned manageability as one of those 4 pillars just earlier within this discussion that we're having, and I want to talk about network management. So on a network management level, what are operators looking for NFV?
Well, certainly the ability to manage the upgrade and patching process of a network is going to be important. Keeping those services available through platform and application upgrades is something that's going to be important for operators and something that's a high priority. In terms of policy, being able to provide that network quality of service, whether it's throughput, latency constraints, whatever those the specific application constraints are for components of a virtual network function, the platform needs to be able to deliver on those and adapt to changing circumstances. So those are the key areas, I think, where the network management and policy application is going to be important.
Yeah, I think completely. I think we're seeing that. I think what you've outlined makes complete sense because it bounds it, right? I think where things get confused sometimes in the management side of things is that we look at it more broadly, right? Yeah. And that so much of the conversation, I think, over the last year has really been around mono, right? Which is management and orchestration. Yes. And by bounding it the way you have, I think we get back to that, what do we need to do versus what do we want to do going forward, right? You know, the 10-5-year horizon, which is where things tend to get bogged down, right? Because I don't know how many times I've had conversations where mono is sort of the bane of this industry because no one really knows what it means, or are we there, or are we getting there? Do I need to orchestrate things when I'm deploying to, VNFs right now? Yeah. And I think by looking at that, by thinking about it more narrowly of what do we need to do to keep the services up? How do I manage the infrastructure? How do I manage the VNFs? How do I actually manage this upgrade process? I think that's sort of the question of requirements and what are they looking for versus wish list of what would be nice to have and what will we need at some point, but how do we at least get rolling and walking?
Yeah. So for a long time, we're talking about carrier-grade networks that had a certain definition, a discussion around that topic. Right now, we're talking about carrier-grade services. Dave, I'm going to start with you on this final question. How does OPNFV, as an organization, as an event, how does it facilitate that conversation to carrier-grade services?
Well, there are a number of things. There are OPNFV projects covering all of the areas we've talked about, whether it's fault management, propagating errors from the platform up to management platforms to allow them to adopt, whether it's the policy definition and understanding how we can specify the lifecycle management and lifecycle events from an application layer and have those be reflected in the platform. We're working on high availability of services, making sure that instances are available so that if an instance goes down, that the service remains up. And all of these are different aspects of what you're saying, making sure that we're giving an infrastructure that allows the applications to be carrier grade. But I think it's important to point out that a big chunk of the work is going to be around automating the deployment of services, making sure that those services are scale out, and making sure that where possible we're abstracting state away from instances to allow them to be stateless so that we can scale them across groups and really have a situation where if a single instance of an application goes down, we don't care, because we can just detect that the single instance went down, understand why it went down, whether it's a host problem or a guest problem, and just start a new one. Right, and that's really the end goal, is getting to a point where the promise of NFV is the ability to scale the operation of the service beyond what's possible today, to enable a single system administrator to manage hundreds or thousands of instances, because we're giving them good situational awareness of what's going on in the platform right across the network, that we're getting good metrics from those applications, and that we're allowing a single point of control for a distributed application. I think that's the promise and what we all want to get to. But a big chunk of that is going to be on redesigning and redeploying applications for that architecture.
I mean, I think so. That's obviously the promise. And it's always interesting to sort of think about, well, how is the promise getting rolled out? Is there the interest? Is this just a body talking about sort of what they'd like to see? And I obviously can't add much to that other than the fact that if you think about it, it's worthwhile taking a step back and thinking, how old is OPNFV, right? I mean, I think we take for granted some of this, the realization that just a little bit over a year old, right? And you look at the amount of interest, you look at the number of folks that are here, I can tell you that when we had customers who talked about it and about launching it, we're like, how necessary is that? Isn't that just, that's the promise, isn't that just going to happen? But you look at the number of folks that are here and the amount of work that's gone into it, and clearly it's not just this question of this promise, but it's the question of that's what people want to see happen, and they're actually working to make it happen. So I think it's a great sign.
So clearly a number of challenges around these carrier-grade services. With your observation of this event here, OPNFV, and Peter, I'll start with you this time. What do you see as the biggest challenge going forward, let's say in the next year or two, in the NFV space as far as this topic we're talking about?
Yeah, I think in all of this space, I think the biggest thing, and this won't be the first time people have heard this, it really is sort of making these issues strategic and making it part of the culture. I think because we've heard over and over again that, and it's not, I think we knew this from the beginning, the telco versus IT question, and is this just an interesting, shop talk thing, or is it real? But I think we've really seen this issue of culture become one that's very important to making it clear that we need to get this stuff done. We need to move on new architectures. We need to think about open differently than the SP community traditionally has, and getting that to be not just there's this small group of people that are trying to make happen, but part of the culture so that the whole organization is moving in that direction, so that it's a real agenda issue.
And one of the things that's most interesting to me about OPNFV is we're essentially building this new network architecture on top of what is enterprise infrastructure.
Right.
And bringing some of one of the key things about OPNFV is that we're bringing those telco industry concerns around performance, around manageability, around reliability to that enterprise infrastructure. And it's something that's actually very interesting in other industry verticals, whether it's the financial services industry where they have a deep requirement for performance and reliability, or scientific computing, where some of the performance issues that we're addressing in OPNFV are also going to be very useful there. So that's really, for me, the really interesting thing is we're building this on standard enterprise focused open source components and adapting them, and a lot of the adaptations that we're doing are interesting beyond telco. And that's one of the things that's been interesting to me in OPNFV is bringing these telco concerns and expressing them in a way that kind of expresses the broader benefits of what we're doing.
And Dave Neary and Peter Jarick, it was great having you both on. Clearly, the telco community has to not only be in the connectivity business, but also in the services business. And clearly, Red Hat, the Linux Foundation, and OPNFV have been behind this effort. So we appreciate both of your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.